A warm welcome to our discussion on reinforcing democracy in the age of COVID-19, perspectives from the OECD Observatory on civic space. I'm Katerina Hadjimitseva-Evans, Director of the European Centre for Non-Profit Law, and I will be moderating your session today. We are at a critical moment of our societies. The urgency and need to adopt emergency measures when the pandemic started is long gone. Yet, those emergency measures, which restricted our democracies and rights, still remain and aim to remain permanent. The rollout of those measures exposed the vulnerability of our democratic values and institutions. We saw that no society is fully immune to democratic backsliding. In this context, the space for civil society operation became further restricted and continues to feel pressure. The emergency measures affected our freedoms and limited the ability to assemble, associate, express ourselves, or live in privacy. And I want to mention that while some governments used the momentum to impose such measures, many others found a way to balance our need to preserve our health and our freedoms. And it's really important to mention those because they showed that the balance can be achieved. Importantly, civil society in its all forms, from individuals, movements and formal organizations, were undeterred. They continued to go out on the streets to protest and to help those in need. So as we move from the post-pandemic era into the one of recovery, we really need to stop and think, what kind of societies do we like to build? How can we build societies which will allow us to embrace the opportunities of our future, but also respond to the global drivers which will challenge our sustainability and existence on this planet? How can we open spaces for collaborative action, for individual voices, for civil society gatherings, and protect those most vulnerable? And how can we make a priority the safeguarding of democratic values, even in mature democracies? I welcome everybody here in Paris, those online, and I kindly ask you to join us in our discussion because we have remarkable speakers here with us today. Allow me to introduce them. I would like to first welcome Ms. Elsa Pilichowski, Director of the OECD Public Governance Directorate. We have also Mr. Gerald Staberok, Chairman of the Board of the EU Human Rights Defenders Mechanism. We have Mr. Darren Walker, the President of the Ford Foundation, and Ms. Laura Lucchesi, Director of ETALAP, the French Prime Minister's Task Force for Digital Innovation and Transformation in Government. Welcome, and we are delighted to have you with us. Let me start with you, Elsa. Can you please tell us a little bit more about the OECD new focus on reinforcing democracy?
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Thank you, Katerina. Thank you to all of you for being here today online or at the forum itself. So now I'd like to say just how happy I am to be here with you. This is the second anniversary since the Observatory for Civic Space. It was created at this forum 2 years ago, and I'd like to thank the Ford Foundation for their support to this initiative. And this is a strategic initiative. It's part of the strategy for reinforcing democracy within OECD countries. And so this comes from a vision where the 38 member countries of the OECD that they have established for the next 10 years. And this includes common values, including strengthening democracy and strengthening the individual freedoms and a whole host of other values that concern democracy. The way that governments are thinking about reinforcing democracy takes place today in the 38 OECD countries at a time when they feel that democracies are in difficulty. Basically, since the mid-1990s, all studies show very clearly that public satisfaction in the way democracy is functioning is low. We have trust levels that are low, that about 50% of people in OECD countries trust their government. About the equivalent number, a little bit less, think that they have a say in what the government does. And a small majority still thinks that democracies work for them.
So countries are realizing that it's time to act. And even in the most mature and the most advanced democracies, there is now the willingness, or even it is a priority to preserve democracies and to strengthen democracies. So they have defined three main areas of action, three main areas to study also. One is the fight against mis and disinformation, and let me say here that of course mis and disinformation has always existed in democracies, and I would even dare to say that it's even needed in democracies. That said, new technologies have allowed, I would say, some undermining forces to be empowered much more than before. The second area where countries will be focusing on will be participation and representation in government decision-making. This is what is, of course, most relevant to our discussion today. It's what we call, democracy 2.0, if you want, where civil society citizens are more empowered, are more represented in government, better represented, with a much more granular representation of civil society in our government. And the third area where they want to work on is really on the capacity of governments to address global challenges. One of the things that I want to say is that, yes, governments are motivated by democracy, but they're also motivated by the fact that to implement policies, to do policies today, they need high trust. For example, if you take the green challenge, it will require enormous transformations of societies that is steered by governments. And right now, governments do not have the trust levels that citizens should be given them to make those transformations possible. So there's many parts to their motivation. One is to preserve democracy, but another one is to be able to make policies. So, that's what we're doing today. Thank you.
Thank you. And you make a very important point about the need to preserve democracy, but in the same time open up and create trust for people to be involved and support you in that process. So what does the Observatory for Civic Space do to facilitate that?
So the Observatory of Civic Space is really, of course, very central to this reinforcing democracy agenda. And we're actually very happy because it's going to be a very strategic element for the future of the reinforcing democracy agenda. It's really I would say, the sine qua non condition, the first condition to allow this reinforcing democracy initiative to be effective. We're working, the way the OECD, what the OECD does best. And what the OECD does best is first compare, analyze, and get evidence. So here, for this, we have collected data on the civic space in 50 countries, including 30 OECD countries, that we will publish at the beginning of in the middle of 2022, where we will have comparative data and analysis across countries, and hoping that countries will be able to compare with each other and will be motivated, to do better in certain areas compared to others. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we do at the OECD very well is what we call recommendations. And recommendations are really legal standards. Some of them are legally binding. The majority is not legally binding, but still very powerful. Where we basically, countries gather and decide on what, best practices are and what countries should be striving for in terms of the civic space. And then we have to monitor progress, and they compare each other in terms of the progress made. It's a very powerful tool, and we have some demands from our members to start working on an OECD recommendation on the civic space, hoping really to create a race to the top. And the third thing that we're doing, we have started doing civic space scans. The first one was done in Finland. We launched it in June, I think, and it was very powerful. As you can imagine, Finland is a country where the civic space is doing pretty well on average, but still they are concerned about the civic space narrowing. But we're also working with other countries such as Portugal, Morocco, Tunisia, Romania, and some others to start doing civic space scans so that we can go in depth into one country and give specific recommendations to the government.
Thank you very much. I think it's really important what you said in terms of comparing, understanding, zooming in, scanning, and producing recommendations that governments can be inspired by, but also committed to protect and improve our spaces. So looking further and a bit more zooming in into the situation of human rights defenders, Gerald, your organizations and the Human Rights Defender Mechanism has been quite active during the pandemic to protect and to support defenders as they face challenges externally, but also by their governments. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think the first thing is when we speak about civic space, sometimes it sounds very abstract. It's a little bit, there's this French chanson, Mon mec à moi, il me parle de l'amour comme la voiture. Love like to a car, about a car. And what we see in our work protecting human rights offenders, that it's very concrete. We see very concretely the space closing. We had to provide security and personal support grants in more than 1,000 cases. We had to relocate people, which is more difficult during the pandemic because borders are closed. Governments have visa regimes that make it very difficult to protect. We have to support organizations that are an imminent threat. So when we speak about closing space, it always sounds like a very civilized concept in a way. But when you speak about the human rights offenders that are actually key in protecting the rights and keeping our space open, it's a very concrete issue. But I want to say something very positive also, because we always point to the negative trends, and I will come to those. But I think if you look at how human rights defenders have dealt with the crisis, I think it's quite remarkable. I think you see a lot of innovation, you see a lot of resilience, and you see a lot of new ways of monitoring violations and others. And I would wish that sometimes state institutions would have been as resilient and as innovative in responding to this crisis. And therefore, one of the calls of this meeting here, I think, is also we have to make them part of the recovery stage. Now, when we talk about the patterns and the challenges they face, I think clearly there is a protection challenge that pre-existed. I mean, the world has not stopped turning. You still have the Belarus, you have Afghanistan, you have Sudan. That's not COVID, but it requires protection. But you've seen specific challenges. You've seen more vulnerability because of cyber threats, the NSO issue, for example, the Pegasus that is used primarily, it appears, against civil dissent and human rights offenders. You see challenges in laws that are adopted that stifle civic space. What I see as a parallel as somebody who has worked for 10 years on counterterrorism after 9/11 and human rights is we see the same patterns. We see a global agenda which has as such a bona fide cause. I mean, we want to protect health, but we see laws and policies being enacted that disregard human rights, that have either the inbuilt overreach or in some countries they are abused, but nobody speaks to the abusers about the abuse. And I think we have to learn that after 9/11, it took us 10 years to bring human rights halfway on the same level as the security agenda. I hope we have a different situation here, that we bring human rights and human rights defenders on the same level playing field in this debate. One point I still want to make is the detention issues of human rights defenders, because those are little earthquakes for civic space. We have monitored within Protect Defenders more than 400 cases of human rights offenders in detention. And I think those are key moments where we need protection. But we've also seen in the COVID that there are immediate threats to defenders in detention. And many countries have released initially in the COVID period human rights people from detention, but they have systematically excluded human rights offenders from these release schemes. So there are a couple of issues I think that are important to be addressed. But there are also good things. I think there's also hope. I think there's also an experience we have, and I think networks are key to the protection of human rights offenders. I feel we're sometimes more networked now with the virtual world. I've been once in India in 10 years before. I've participated in 5 or 6 meetings in India the last year. And I think that's also a reality. We are more connected, and we should keep this as well.
So let me pick up on the point you said about the sort of resemblance between the counterterrorism responses and the emergency responses. And I think this is a parallel we hear more intensively, especially nowadays with the 20 years since 9/11. So what can we learn from that? What are the immediate opportunities now happening globally that we can step up on to protect and course correct
I think the first thing is a sea change, that we see human rights and human rights defenders as central to the solution. I mean, the COVID crisis, the health crisis, is a human rights crisis. The response that came to the streets, literally, is a human rights issue. I mean, you have in the United States the George Floyd issue, the Black Lives Matters. We call it social justice, we call it racial justice, but it's about human rights. It's about the rights of people and those who defend those rights. So I think we have to see human rights as part of the solution. And I think in this also, and this is why a meeting like here is very important, is that we stop siloing things. And that happened with counterterrorism. You had one debate on counterterrorism with the counterterrorism people, and you had one debate on human rights and counterterrorism with the human rights people. And if we want to make progress here, I think we have to have these debates transversal. And I think that's one of the issues that I would see. But the last point I want to make here is also, I mean, what are global opportunities? I think we have to seize opportunities. I firmly believe that every crisis has opportunities. And I think that's maybe also a mindset we need in addressing this. If I have one wish to state, it's holding the line. I've spoken with a Turkish human rights defenders before coming here. And he always tells me, I don't provoke, but I don't retreat. And I think that's true for Western states as well and democracies. Don't retreat. The space you give up, you will not regain. And I think that's my plea in a way, that we are more conscious on this, because I think we see that states are getting more cautious in intervening on human rights issues or when human rights offenders are detained.
Yes, and that actually resonates really well with the topic we are discussing about reinforcing, not retreating, and preserving our values. So Darren, when the pandemic started, the Ford Foundation came out very boldly and supported its grantees, its partners, with funding, with comfort, with guidance. Can you please tell us what did you see and how did you feel it's important to come out and do that? What were the trends that motivated you to step up so robustly?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Katerina, and I'm really happy to be here. I think for the Ford Foundation, we understand that civil society is the oxygen of democracy. Without a robust and vibrant civil society and the institutions that are necessary for them, we can't have vibrant democracy. And so our mission is in part at the Ford Foundation to strengthen democratic practice and democratic institutions. If we are to do that, the path is through civil society, and therefore the civic space is critical. We made significant grants to NGOs, particularly organizations that are working on the front lines. We made those grants, the majority of them as unrestricted general operating support, because that kind of infrastructure support is essential. And unfortunately, too few foundations, too few donors. I like to say that we donors project support our grantees to death. And we need to think about how to invest in them to build their infrastructure. The things that I worry about, though, are the trends, and Gerard spoke very well to those. But the larger issue that we've not addressed that I think influences the lack of trust is the growing inequality and how inequality contributes to the enabling environment for authoritarianism. Citizens will indeed release the governments from accountability in some ways. They will surrender their human rights. They will surrender fundamental rights as citizens because they have been both fed misinformation and disinformation, and they are also seeing in their societies the chasm between the privileged, the wealthy, who are by and large being served by government. Their needs are being met. Their needs are often low taxes, little regulation as possible, all of the things that generate wealth, that generate privilege for the already privileged. And so citizens are seeing the compounding effect and are therefore vulnerable. And authoritarians know, understand the psychology of vulnerable citizens. And we see around the world, as we see 143 countries enacting restrictions that citizens succumb to, citizens go along with. It's why we have to have civil society reminding citizens and being representative of citizens. It's another challenge. Often, frontline civil society is seen by the average citizen as a group of elites. I mean, in America, we have this challenge. Often, civil society may be represented as white, privileged, highly educated. The people who are most in need, the people who are most vulnerable, are black and brown and poor. And that disparity is in part why there is a challenge around trust. And so I think that this issue of trust and inequality, we have to address that because we won't get to solutions without going through inequality.
Thank you very much. And indeed, that's really super important, and thank you for bringing the role of civil society in that effort. So looking ahead, then what are the prospects for civil society to be able to address these challenges and help? What kind of preconditions we need to put in place, as well as governments?
Well, I think the ways in which organizations like the OECD and others are working to elevate the civic space, civil society, that we're seeing a new generation. I mean, this is what's exciting. If you want to be hopeful, spend some time with the next generation of human rights defenders, of people working on the front lines for social justice. They are committed. They are resilient. They are as you say, they may not provoke, but they are not going to retreat. They are firm in their commitment and unwavering in their belief in these ideas of fundamental dignity.
Thank you very much. Laura, the issue of trust has come up very strongly in this discussion, and I know you have been working a lot through your projects to be able to bring back that trust. So can you please put the French civil society in the context of the pandemic, and how did you engage in order to rebuild that trust?
Yeah, thank you. I'm leaving the team in France attached to the Prime Minister who works on digital government. So I will speak a lot about digital issues, but also on the opening from the government to civil society and more participation of citizens and interaction with the civil society. So first of all, I would like to say that first, digital is not only, the civic space is not only digital, but it's a big part, because now I know more and more interactions between citizens and public institutions now take place in the digital space. So there are a lot of issues that we also need to take into consideration very early, and with that perspective. And secondly, also the crisis that we're here talking about with the pandemic, it's our common perspective is to have to deal and learn to also to lead in a context of accumulation of crises, be there migratory, health, economic, social. So we'll have to also learn to be, as a government, but also as a leading institution, more agile and innovative, and learn to be more also agile in the way we cooperate with third parties. So in the context of the pandemic and the emergency measures which tend to restrict the rights, we saw many things, of course. We saw things in the field of misinformation and disinformation. We saw also some threats in the terms of protection of privacy. Also points regarding the use of digital technologies to provide surveillance, but also the risk of exclusion, because again, as people access to services, including public services in the digital world, there is also a big threat of having people, the digital divide, and having people excluded from accessing services and also access to information, and also the possibility to participate to the public debate in the digital area. So there are many challenges that we have to take into account, but I would also point to new opportunities and that the crisis management and the way of being more collaborative, because in France, for instance, due to the crisis, we've seen a lot of cooperations between government agencies themselves and also with third parties. And we have to learn from those lessons as well for the future. So first, the way for government, the condition is to be open. I mean, it's the basic condition. So, for instance, by providing data, collecting data, including also on rights violations, for instance, sharing data and comparing data, but put them in the open as well. So in all the fields that could be found. So in the field of health, for instance, in France, we have gathered a lot of data in the government agency on the spreading of the pandemic. We've put that online on our open data platform, data.gouv.fr. And my team, for instance, developed dashboards to facilitate decision-making of agencies. But we saw very interesting initiatives from the civil society, individuals, journalists. First of all, the fact of putting just the data online enabled the media to provide information on the pandemic. And for instance, one guy, Guillaume Rosier, developed a dashboard that became the reference for giving information to the public, and his role was very important. So as an external trusted third party, he was also able to contribute to build trust in the information that the government gave with his innovation. The second point is also not only put the data open, but also the algorithm. For instance, there were many services during the pandemic to help people who had symptoms to do the right action, to go to the hospital and so on. And my team, for instance, worked on documenting the algorithm that would guide people and again to publish them in the open so that other people could use the same information, but it was auditable. And the capacity to audit also the algorithm and have third parties to look into the code and make sure the information is equitable and the decisions that are made are equitable are very important. Third point is also to, from the civil society, I love what you said about being the oxygen of democracy. We also have to invest commonly in civil society that are tech savvy. Again, it's not the main thing, but more and more we'll need people who help other people to defend their rights in the digital world. And lastly, another interesting opportunity is again to share practices, collect data, and use platforms and cooperations with researchers, activists, other groups and government bodies to develop corporations and build innovative, agile initiatives which are part of the response in the recovery phase, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're receiving some questions from the audience, so if you don't mind, I'll just like to turn to that, and I would really appreciate any reflections from any of you of what we've heard. But the first question I would like to address is around the civic rights and fundamental freedoms. Are they relative? Do they change over time? And where can we find the laws that teach us about absolute truth and justice around those? Are the civic rights absolute? And are the civic rights change over time? Elsa or Gerald?
I'm happy to start.
Go ahead.
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, first, yes, there are some rights that are absolute, and whether they are changing in times, it's the circumstances that change over time, on how they are expressed or how they are safeguarded. And I would like to rebound on this matter on what Laure just said about digital. Institutions and the protection of the civic space were designed and made over time, over centuries, in a world that was not digital, and we tend to underestimate the change that digital has made for the civic space. I do believe that this is something that has been underthought, undermanaged, and underregulated, and has provided opportunities for those who want to abuse the vulnerable, as you were saying, use the vulnerable or direct them to answers or institutional answers that are not the ones for civic space. That is what has happened. It has been underregulated, underthought. So the basic civic rights, the basic protection of the civic space, digital has provided an enormous opportunity for opening of civic space. And what we are seeing now is that the forces, it has also decoupled the power of those who want to abuse the vulnerable. And right now, that balance between the positives and the negatives of the digital world for the civic space is unclear, in my view. And this is something that we want to work in the future, because the conditions have changed.
Yep.
The conditions of the exercise of the civic space have changed. Definitely.
Gerald, would you like to?
I think you said it all. I think that the importance is there is a human rights framework. And I mentioned this, we have debates about social justice, we have debates about racial justice. But in the end, it's about people that have rights. And I think the key point for me is always, if you think about the pandemic and what happened and what has to happen, is the human rights framework is there. It's about the implementation of the framework. It's about empowerment. It's about making human rights an equal playing partner to policymakers in this field. Human rights allow us to adjust to situations. It is a living instrument, and it will probably go stronger as a human rights framework after the pandemic, because we will learn from it.
Yes. Would you like to? Yes, Laura?
Just quickly to say again, the framework is there, but for instance, again, in the digital world, there are new things that you will have to be able to assess. For instance, non-discrimination. If you have an algorithm making a decision, be it from the government, even all the more so from the government, but also from private players, how do you make sure that you're able to go back at all the steps of this decision and the algorithm to be able to understand what has been applied to you, and is that equal to other people? There are no bias, no discrimination. So probably the framework remains the same, but the way you implement it and play with it and implement it is very important. So there are new stakes, new questions to be addressed.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I would like to take a moment to talk a little bit about this changing civic space environment in terms of where do we express ourselves. And indeed, the pandemic allowed us to explore much more the digital space and the online space. And I would like to also point out here that actually the human rights frameworks which were developed in the meantime were done in a way to recognize that our rights are protected offline and online. And there were two issues that came out from your intervention, Laura, that one is that while we moved online, surveillance increased on our activities, both online and offline. So my follow-up question would be, what thoughts are there in terms of what we should do to sort of restrain and refrain from misuse of surveillance in the responses as one fundamental to rebuild trust? Would anybody like to address that? Elsa?
I can start with saying how complicated it is. I know it's not a very satisfactory answer, but I will say, because surveillance today can happen from the government, which is very serious, and we see that in a lot of autocratic systems. It can happen from the private sector. It can even happen from civil society groups themselves. It can happen from any parts. It depends on who's mastering the technology. And one of the issues is that it's not for any of those actors to step in alone in either regulating or finding standards or finding their own ways on how to do it. It's a collective effort. It has to be, civil society. It's got to be, to some extent, the private sector. It's got to be governments together, finding solutions. So, and it's something on which we don't know really well how to do yet. This collective effort.
Absolutely, Darren.
I would just add that we don't know, but one thing we do know is that civil society does not have the capacity that we need to build that capacity. That we need to build that capacity by investing in them so that they can have the capability to work on behalf of the public interest. There is something here called the public interest that has not been defined. I mean, this is what we are working through, and thus far, the public interest has been defined by what the private sector in this new digital world tells us it is. And I think that's one of the real issues, Laura, that you raise, the capacity to understand bias in AI. You don't get that from a social science degree. I mean, you've got to have people who understand how AI is constructed. Those are new skills, new credentials, new backgrounds. So what are we doing to draw in code writers and technologists into the human rights field? This has not been something that in the analog world was of concern. But in this new digital world, we have to craft a new field called public interest, and we are already seeing the implications because civil society is really being harmed and often doesn't have the capability to respond.
Yeah, that was my point. It's exactly this. Build the right cooperations between all the stakeholders, media, researchers, activists, and government bodies, again, to some extent. So be able to build that and, again, invest in capacity building. And even from the government perspective, we have to think of what we would like to put in place to be, again, more as open as possible by providing data, all the resources that we can put and share. And the OECD at the global level helps also put all those resources together to monitor, compare, provide resources for others, and again, reinforce capacity at the global level by sharing practices, experiences, and again, crafting all the necessary resources to again, defend those rights in the new digital era.
Yeah. Thank you. And I think that's a really important point. And just I would like to add that while we also need to bring human rights to the digital world and to those who draft and who create and who engineer, we also need to bring confidence in the human rights groups. I think we were discussing this in preparation for this session to understand why they have a role to play and a say to say, even if they're not tech specialists, in terms of how the algorithms or the technology affect their right. I would like to also give you a moment to ask if you have any other reflections of what the other said before we move forward to the questions before. Good. I would also we spoke about the importance of what governments can do and what governments need to commit to, but how can we make them do that? We have lots of resistance among governments to actually undertake these new commitments and lead the way. What are the ways in which we can try to motivate them and inspire them to do it? Elsa, if you have any suggestions.
Again, I'll start with what is difficult today and where we're working. But what is difficult in this field is that governments in themselves can be abusive. I mean, by definition, and that's why we have information ecosystems that have been designed to avoid also abuse and interference from governments. So part of the regulation of government stepping in this system is about government retracting and letting others evolve and letting civil society grow and blossom. So I'm always myself a public governance specialist. I'm very much in favor of government and in favor of regulation. That's in my DNA. But at the same time, I'm also concerned about government stepping in now. So there is a need for them to step in because big forces, and especially private sector forces, have become too dominant in terms of the standards that are being set up worldwide. But at the same time, it's also a dangerous game. So again, it's about having this balance between the different actors and bringing especially civil society in that game stronger with better capacities. So how can we make them do something collectively, again, because I think that collective is really important. For us, the idea is to always raise the bar, and it's also compare, making sure that that countries are able to compare, that we have the data, the analysis. It's difficult. That's why we'll also have other actors, same thing, looking at the individual data. We have partnerships with some civil society organizations to get the data on journalism, on civic space, etc. Compare, study, and make official legal recommendations. That's what we do.
Yeah, thank you. Did you? No, sorry, Gerald. I thought that you wanted to follow up on that.
No, I mean, maybe when it comes to the protection of human rights offenders, for example, as key actors in the civic space debate, we have many governments that have explicit policies for the protection of human rights offenders. But it's about implementing them.
Yes.
And in the end of the day, I think it's also about the faith in your own ideals. I feel that we need self-questioning in the human rights community, in the democracy movement, etc. But we have to remember the strength of our standards. I always say towards the US, in some way there was always military might, but to me the American dream was always more forceful and more compelling to the world. And I think it's what we see with defenders that go to Europe, for example. They believe sometimes more in the strength of Europe than I feel Europe is feeling itself. And I'm German from origin. We've learned about the Weimar Republic. We say it didn't go down because of the enemies of democracies. It went down because it didn't have enough friends of democracy. So I think one emphasis has to be keep believing, but also grow this group of friends.
Definitely. And I think we have time for one last question, and I would like to put a bit of a challenge there, because Gerald, you said civil society, civic space is civilized context and concept, and then I kind of made me wonder and think, what did you mean by that?
I think I meant more that sometimes we speak about abstract concepts. Democracy is an abstract concept. Human rights, you had a question of standards, it appears abstract. Civic space, it becomes like a discipline, a new discipline of a discourse and conferences like this. But in the end of the day, it's something that is very down to earth. It has to do with justice causes, it has to do with minorities, it has to do with the protection of human rights offenders. So the answer, the recipe of dealing with it is also a very concrete way. How do we protect people in the field that needs the protection? So that's what I meant, that sometimes we can speak in very abstract terms, but it comes down to something very concrete in people's lives.
And Darren, can I ask you to please follow up on that? You are very much engaged in public life for different areas in society. You speak passionately about the groups on the ground working and, trying to expose inequalities, injustices. On a personal level, what does this mean to you, civic space, civil society?
Well, on a personal level, this is a profound idea. I grew up poor in America, black in the rural South of America, and it was only through the perseverance of civil society, of black and white leaders, communities coming together to demand the accountability of government and the private sector to deliver on our democratic ideals. The gap between the rhetoric and the lived experience of many people continues to grow in the world. And I think it's that delta, that gap between the abstract ideas that Gerard speaks of so eloquently. Those ideas are remote because people are living day to day. They're living day to day, often in desperation and without dignity. What democracy is supposed to provide people is both dignity and justice. And so what civil society can unlock is just that, right? And so for me, it is civil society is the sort of intermediating force between these abstract ideas and how people actually experience their citizenship, their day-to-day lives in a country.
Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for your very thoughtful, deep, inspirational ideas. I would like to just make a few points in conclusion from what you said. I think we spoke a lot about the fact that we need leaders on the side of governments, friends, and in civil society. We spoke about the importance of not being complacent about the situation we're in. We also spoke about the importance of coming together collectively in joining and creating and unlocking the potentials that we see ahead, building capacity of everybody to be able to be meaningfully and equally involved, about concrete commitments to revoke emergency powers, to control surveillance, to protect against protesters. These are the rules which we think we need to move forward in order to rebuild and become more creative. I would like to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and inspirations with us. I would like to also thank the audience for taking part virtually and here with us. I would like to thank the Observatory of Civic Space for helping us organize this discussion and the Paris Peace Forum for facilitating us and being able to be here. Please look out for the global report on civic space, which is coming up in 2022 from the Global Observatory. Please zoom in, have your states scanned so that we can recheck the health of our democracies and civic space, and do stay in touch. We need collective action. Thank you very much for this wonderful discussion. Thank you, everybody.